2 years after completing the smash hit manga Death Note, its creators Tsugumi Ohba and Takeshi Obata released a new work in the pages of Shonen Jump, Bakuman, a manga about a pair of boys who set out to become professional manga artists. Bakuman is a thrilling tale about the trials and tribulations of Moritaka Mashiro and Akito Takagi, from their humble beginnings, when they first pair up in middle school and create their first work, until they become the most popular manga artists of their time. But Bakuman is also a love letter to the genre of shonen manga, as well as a reflection on the successes and failings of their previous work, Death Note. Bakuman is filled with direct and implicit references to other manga, especially to Death Note. And what I want to show here is that these references introduce a layer of meta-commentary that informs and enriches the narrative of Bakuman. Hello, my name is Sean, and I break down what makes great stories tick. Now, I'm sure that most everyone watching this will be familiar with Death Note already, but I want to go over some key aspects about this series that will be important for understanding of Bakuman up front. Both Death Note and Bakuman ran in Weekly Shonen Jump, the most popular manga magazine in Japan. Among the many titles published in Jump are some of the most successful and influential manga ever created, including Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, My Hero Academia, and Demon Slayer. These kinds of uplifting, action-adventure fantasy stories are the bread and butter of Shonen Jump. Death Note, in many ways, is an outlier in the Jump canon. The story revolves around Light Yagami, an extremely intelligent high school student who acquires a notebook that will kill anyone whose name is written in its pages. Light decides to use the notebook to kill criminals and become God, as it were. His actions eventually attract the attention of the detective L, who sets out to uncover the mystery behind the series of killings and arrest their perpetrator. Death Note is a suspenseful battle of wits between two geniuses, between the detective trying to identify the killer and the killer trying to uncover the detective's true name and eliminate him. Unlike most successful Jump manga, the conflict of Death Note is a battle of minds, with few flashy action scenes and fantastical superpowers. And despite some of the story's fantasy elements, the story and the world and the characters of Death Note appear much more grounded than that of a typical Jump manga. Death Note also sports a darker, more realistic art style, in comparison to that of other shonen series. Now, another important aspect when comparing Death Note with other shonen manga is that its protagonist is the villain rather than the hero. Well, Light initially wants to use his notebook to eliminate crime and make Japan a better place. His control over life and death eventually go to his head, and he gradually becomes more evil, more manipulative, and more detached from reality. Probably the most contentious issue surrounding Death Note is the story's second half. Death Note ran for a bit more than 2 years and can be structurally divided into two halves. The halfway point of the manga is marked by what is arguably the most pivotal moment in the story. At long last, Light pulls off an elaborate ploy and gets L killed. The story then skips forward 4 years and introduces two new characters as L's successors, Nier and Mello, who in turn set out in pursuit of Light. For various reasons, the second half of the series is significantly less well received than the first half. And although I don't want to delve into too many details on this issue, one of the most important factors here is the absence of L himself. It is hard to overstate just how popular L is. At the time of writing, almost 20 years after Death Note came to a close, he is still the 4th most popular character on my anime list. And Light also here holds an incredible 6th spot. Much of the initial draw of the series is the back and forth between these seemingly equally matched opponents. With the death of one of the series' most popular characters then, many fans probably just lost interest. And this is exasperated further by the fact that Nier is conspicuously similar to L. He is very close to the original in design and mannerisms, but he lacks the charisma that made so many fall in love with L in the first place. The perceived fall of Death Note is not just an issue for Western fans, or something that cropped up after the series was completed. For an immediate drop in popularity can already be traced during the series' original run. Every issue of Shonen Jump comes with a survey asking its readers to list their 3 favorite chapters of the week, and the results of these surveys play an important role in determining the order of the manga series in future issues of the magazine. This graph here shows the position of every chapter of Death Note in Jump's table of contents. The series rank broadly reflects the survey results from 7 issues ago. This here is the chapter where L died, and taking the 7-chapter gap into account, you can see an immediate drop in popularity after the death of L. Now to return to Bakuman, and I promise that the importance of all these preliminaries will become apparent soon. Let me start by showing why I believe that Bakuman invites its readers to seek out a layer of meta-commentary in the story. The first reason is that Bakuman itself explicitly references other real-world manga. Its characters frequently discuss manga series that exist in our worlds. From the very beginning of the story, Mashiro and Takagi aim to publish a series in Shonen Jump, the very magazine that Bakuman itself was published in. Bakuman even prominently features real-life Shonen Jump editors among its casts. One of my favorite aspects of early Bakuman is actually how Mashiro and Takagi bond over their love for manga and talk about their favorite series. And when Mashiro tells his family that he wants to become a manga artist, his father even alludes to scenes from classic manga to encourage his son to pursue his dreams. Now, the most significant of all these early references are the references to Death Note itself. Death Note is the first real-life manga mentioned in Bakuman. Ohba and Obata's first series together is mentioned twice in the very first chapter. Mashiro and Takagi first interact with each other when Mashiro forgets his notebook at school. Mashiro returns his classroom to retrieve it, mainly because it contains a drawing of his crush. And when he enters the room, his classmate Takagi sits in waiting for him and holds out the notebook. Mashiro is mortified that Takagi has found out about his secret crush, but Takagi tells him to relax. In his words, it's not like it's a Death Note. Takagi then uses Mashiro's secret as leverage. He promises to return the notebook and keep silent about its contents if Mashiro will create manga with him. Now, on the surface, Takagi's reference to Death Note during his initial meeting with Mashiro may seem like nothing more than a funny nod to the creator's previous series. But, on a meta level, this scene is much more significant than it first appears. Over the course of Bakuman, it will become apparent that the writer and artist duo, Takagi and Mashiro, to a certain extent mirror the story's actual writer and artist, Ohba and Obata. Unlike the manga characters, however, Ohba and Obata actually never met before Death Note was serialized. You could say that these two creators were literally brought together by Death Note, just as how the initial meeting between Mashiro and Takagi was facilitated by a notebook that was explicitly compared to the eponymous Death Note. At the same time, the scene also serves as a bridge of sorts between the old and the new series. For just as in Death Note, the discovery of a notebook sets the events of Bakuman in motion. And while the notebook in Bakuman is not an otherworldly murder weapon, but a more mundane object, it is a tool that is as indispensable to aspiring manga creators as to Light's megalomaniac ambitions. And to drive the connection between Death Note and Bakuman home even further, the same chapter references Death Note again a few pages later. Mashiro initially dismisses Takagi's suggestion and explains how difficult it is to eke out a living as a manga artist, something that Mashiro witnessed firsthand because his uncle was a failed manga artist himself. As an example, Mashiro mentions that even the author of Death Note, which by all metrics was a highly successful series, would starve after 5 years if he did not continue working. Here more than ever, it is hard not to read this as a wink from the writer. The very existence of this new manga, after all, corroborates the claim of a fictional character about his real-life creator's financial situation. So, what becomes apparent from all of this is that from the very onset of the story, Bakuman invites us to examine the interplay between reality and fiction, and at times, it even revels in blurring the lines between the two. Obata also acknowledges that this manga is fiction, but it portrays a lot of reality too in the author comments of the final volume of Bakuman. And that may be putting it rather mildly, in fact. Now, the second aspect of Bakuman that makes it particularly susceptible to a meta-interpretation is that the characters in this series constantly analyze manga themselves. Every manga artist in Bakuman has a unique style that reflects their personality. The manga each creator in a story makes serve, as it were, as a mirror of their person. Bakuman offers a staggering amount of intriguing premises for manga, and I know I'm by far not the only one who would genuinely love to read a lot of the stories within the story. All the characters in Bakuman constantly interrogate their own creations, and those of others as well. They comment on the successes and the shortcomings of the internal manga series. And in doing so, Bakuman actually offers its readers genuine lessons on writing and critiquing manga themselves. How remarkably much attention Bakuman dedicates to the process of creating manga really becomes apparent when you compare it with other manga about manga creators, such as Seo Koji's Hitman or Shushuku Sakurai's Stupid Love Comedy, where these aspects are much less present than in Bakuman. And all this is especially the case for the main duo. Bakuman showcases the growth of Mashiro and Takagi, who publish under the pen name Muto Ashirogi, less through character development than through their improvement in their craft. Each new manga they create marks a pivotal moment in their development as manga artists, and a new stage towards fulfilling their dreams. By the end of the story, Mashiro and Takagi draw from the sum of all their experiences to create their masterpiece Reversi, the work that becomes the most acclaimed series in Shonen Jump. And what is particularly striking about this series is that this is something we'll discuss in a moment, in many ways closely resembles Death Note, but also makes some significant changes that address some of the issues concerning Death Note's reception. Now, the greatest challenge for Takagi over the course of the story is balancing his strengths as a writer with the duo's chosen demographic. The first stories that they create are all high-concept science fiction stories. Their first manga, The Two Earths, is a story in which the Earth is actually a clone of the real Earth, used to conduct experiments. Next, they create 100 Millionth, where society is governed by a supercomputer that ranks everyone based on their intellectual and physical abilities. And then their first published story, which is called The World is All About Money and Intelligence, tells of a world where people can buy the contents of each other's minds. Now, many characters in the story point out that Takagi excels at writing highly original series that break the Jump mold, and that have more substance to them than typical shonen manga. But at the same time, the complexity and depth of Takagi's stories prevents them from attaining mainstream appeal. And for that reason, the duo's editor Hattori encourages them to forego the format of Jump battle manga and aim to create a cult hit, a manga with a small but dedicated fanbase. All this frames Takagi as a writer in the same vein as Ohba, and in particular invites a comparison to Death Note. Just like Death Note, Takagi's early creations rely on strong concepts rather than appealing characters, and explore darker themes than most works in the shonen demographic. Takagi's shortcomings become all the more apparent because the Ashiroge duo's style is constantly juxtaposed to that of their rival, Eiji Nizuma. Nizuma is introduced early in the series as a 16-year-old manga prodigy, and in contrast to the calculating writer Takagi, who specializes in complex and highly conceptual stories, Nizuma relies mainly on his intuition and draws the quintessential mainstream battle manga. This rivalry inspires Mashiro and Takagi to strive for more than just a career as manga artists. They also aim to create a manga that is more successful than that of Nizuma. But what Mashiro and Takagi struggle with time and again is how their unique style can compete against the mainstream appeal of Nizuma's works. After their one-shot The World is All About Money and Intelligence gained substantially less votes than that of Nizuma, Mashiro wants to abandon the cult hit approach in favor of something that would appeal to a larger audience. They now try to pen a mainstream battle story themselves, but their draft is rejected outright by their editor. Moreover, the moment when Mashiro and Takagi fail to convince their editor to let them draw a battle manga coincides with their first meeting with Nizuma. Nizuma is asked to draw a draft for his upcoming series in front of the duo, and he not only creates the draft in record speed, but he also confesses that he came up with it during the drafting process itself. All of this serves to establish an insurmountable gap between Takagi and Nizuma. No amount of planning and calculation could allow Takagi and Mashiro to dethrone Bakuman's undisputed king of battle manga with a battle manga of their own. And this is a problem that haunts them throughout most of the series. They have to square their unique qualities with their lack of talents for the standard Jump fare. And it's only towards the end of the series that the duo has amassed enough experience as manga artists that they can blend their signature style with the trappings of typical Jump battle manga. What Takagi lands on is a so-called non-traditional battle manga, a battle of minds in place of physical combats. Mashiro later suggests that this concept would only work if the story stars a dark anti-hero. At first, their editor is reluctant about this approach. He's scared that Jump will not improve with a character that is downright evil. So Takagi emphasizes that the point of this character is to prompt the reader to reflect on his morality, to ponder if he's actually good or evil. This is the basic premise that Takagi comes up with. The protagonist is a smart but ignorant high school student who is gifted the power to transfer thoughts into the minds of other people by a demon. This person is convinced of his moral superiority to other people, and wants to brainwash the entire world to share his worldview. In Takagi's eyes, this contrast between a good intention and objectionable methods would create an interesting moral quandary. Takagi then imagines that his actions will eventually attract the attention of the police, but by meddling in the affair, they in turn run a greater risk to be brainwashed themselves. This basic premise forms the foundation for Reversi, the series that finally makes Mashiro and Takagi the most successful authors in Shonen Jump. So, Reversi is a story about a genius high schooler who receives a power from a supernatural entity and uses it to impose his justice on the world. I'm sure I don't have to spell out how blatantly similar this concept is to Death Note. And I'm not gonna lie, when I first read this part of the story, I felt like Ohba and Obata were laying it on a bit thick with this. Did Mashiro and Takagi seriously become the greatest manga artists of their time by penning what is a thinly veiled allegory for Death Note? Moreover, the series title is also a reference to Obata's first major hit. Because before he drew Death Note, Obata rose to fame as an artist for the board game manga Hikaru no Go, written by Yumi Hotta. Hikaru no Go revolves around the strategy board game Go, whereas Reversi derives its name from another strategy board game. Reversi is a game that is kind of similar to Othello, from what I gather. So, what you could say is that basically everything about Reversi is a nod to Ohba and Obata's previous works. Now, it would be disingenuous, however, to dismiss the ending of Bakuman as some kind of strange ego trip. Because what makes Bakuman's stand-in for Death Note so intriguing is that it differs from the original in significant places. In fact, Reversi reads as Ohba's retrospective commentary on Death Note, including its failings. Because after Takagi reveals the premise for Reversi, Mashiro has his doubts that this will be enough to surpass Nizuma's new manga. What we are told here then, on a meta level, is that just recreating Death Note is not enough to make their dreams come true. In Mashiro's view, Reversi is still too much of a cult hit. This is not the kind of story that is a true shonen manga, and will never eclipse the successful mainstream titles in this way. So, instead of going full Death Note, Mashiro suggests a change of course. The original main character will become truly evil, and in response, they will introduce a demon of justice as the second protagonist. And with a mainstream hero who fights for good, they can have, at long last, a true conflict between good and evil, which is after all the bread and butter of shonen battle manga. And this is all a remarkable change from the more morally grey characters of Death Note, where even L, Mir, and Mello were never really framed as champions of justice. But the most conspicuous divergence from Death Note is the way Reversi handles its two protagonists and its ending. And these are exactly the areas where Death Note fell off in the eyes of many fans. The potential pitfalls of Reversi's premise first become apparent when Nizuma's new series Zombie Gun for the first time overtakes Reversi in the reader surveys. At first, Zombie Gun seems to take a page from Reversi's book. It introduces the main character's brother as its main villain, and so makes it seem that just like Reversi, Zombie Gun 2 will have two main characters. Nevertheless, Mashiro has no doubts that the rivalry between their two demons is better set up than that of Nizuma's two brothers. They have, after all, built their entire story around this conflict, whereas in Mashiro's words, Nizuma's villain is just something he threw in at the last minute. But when the first chapters of Reversi get a better reception than Zombie Gun, Nizuma proves that Reversi's strength is also its biggest weakness. What he does is kill off and replace the original enemy with a different, more powerful foe. And that week, Zombie Gun decimates Reversi in the reader surveys. It appears that the readers have picked up on Reversi's weakness. Since the entire premise of this manga revolves around the two protagonists, Reversi lacks the flexibility to change course, even if the readers get bored with the conflict. And once the two realize the limits of their premise, they're also forced to grapple with another question. They have to wonder how long Takagi can stretch out the struggle between the two demons. In Death Note, the possibilities with the conflict between Light and L had run their course after 58 chapters. At that stage, Ohba was confronted with two equally unappealing options. Either he would conclude a successful series, or find a way to prolong the story that entirely revolved around a battle of wits between his two masterminds. Takagi is confronted with the same dilemma from an early stage in Reversi's run, and he too considers the possibility of introducing new enemies after wrapping up the current storyline. But he soon concludes that this would definitely not benefit the story, as, after all, Death Note proved. So, the first solution Takagi reaches is to slow down the story's pace. In other words, to compromise on quality as a means to prolong the series. But Mashiro objects to this course of action. He would rather create a short masterpiece than draw out their work if it gives it middling quality, even at the expense of his own career. He eventually convinces Takagi that they should create their greatest possible story, even if this means that Reversi won't reach the 50 chapter mark. And note how closely this number is to the 58 chapters of the first part of Death Note. Bakuman is here implying that this is the natural length of this type of story. And this is exactly what they end up doing. Despite some initial resistance from Jump's editor-in-chief about ending Reversi so soon, Mashiro and Takagi conclude their series in the span of 6 volumes. Now, Reversi's ending has a reception that speaks for itself. The series is universally lauded as a masterpiece. In other words, Bakuman suggests that Mashiro and Takagi could only create one of the greatest works in Jump history by avoiding the alleged mistake of Death Note. They could pour everything they had into a spectacular climax, rather than continuing the story past the height of its popularity. And what is more, the question of when to end a manga was also explored earlier in Bakuman. 2 story arcs before the conception of Reversi, Nizuma's manga Crow suddenly sees a dramatic improvement, and consistently reaches the #1 spot in the readers' surveys. Nizuma convinces the editor-in-chief to let him end Crow if he manages to get the #1 spot for 20 weeks straight. Nizuma claims that it has always been his goal to end Crow at the peak of its popularity. This is a move that incites debates among both the series' manga artists and the editors. Should a professional manga artist be allowed to end one of Jump's most important series, or is that a selfish move from the creator's part? And Yoshida, one of the Jump editors, makes a further case for continuing Crow. In his view, Crow still has plenty of room for growth, and it would thereby also be in Nizuma's interest to continue drawing his series. In his view, their task as editors is to help bring out the best in their creators, even if that means going against the creator's own wishes. Regardless, Nizuma's aspirations to reach first place in the reader survey for 20 weeks straight spurs on all his colleagues to become the one to dethrone Crow. But as one artist after the other fails to surpass Crow, the characters start admiring Nizuma's achievements. Most illustrative for this is Nizuma's editor, whose career would most directly be impacted by Crow's ending, and who was originally terrified of the prospect of losing his most successful series, and therefore actively rooted against Nizuma's success. But as the weeks progress, his allegiances change. He is increasingly awed by Nizuma's success and begins to support his creator's wishes. And when Mashiro and Takagi lick their wounds after they too failed to surpass Nizuma, they only want to congratulate him for this feat. They reflect on how they would like to end their own series in such a perfect way as well. And this of course anticipates how they will eventually indeed conclude Reversi in a very similar manner. Now, the Crow storyline proves that the question of when to end a manga was very important to Ohba and Obata. Nizuma's goal to end his series as the most popular manga in Jump was even foreshadowed as early as Chapter 9, during Nizuma's first appearance. And Bakuman arguably hammers home the view that a creator should have full autonomy in this matter, even more with Crow than with Reversi. For the dilemma for the Ashiroge duo was if they should drag out the series at the expense of its quality. Whereas in Crow's case, there was no sign that its plot had run its course, that Crow could not have done as well as it did before Nizuma shifted into high gear for a longer time. So in this light, it's also significant that Bakuman singles out only Crow and Reversi for their spectacular endings, because all other serialized manga in Bakuman end either when they peter out or when they get cancelled. So it seems that the question of how to wrap up a manga became an important concern for Ohba and Obata after concluding Death Note. And it's hard to shake the view that this is strongly related to the reception of their previous series. Reversi is also not the only instance where Mashiro and Takagi are confronted with issues that also pertain to Death Note. During the run of their third series, Mashiro at one point notices that they're running out of screen tone rather quickly, and in response, one of his assistants notes that Mashiro is relying too heavily on his screen tones. All this prompts him to compare his art style to that of Nizuma, and he notices that his art was dark even in his lighter works, and became even more so because his current series places heavy emphasis on its realistic setting. Mashiro concludes that this is detrimental to their work. In his words, shonen manga needs to have a brighter feel to it, even the more realistic hits in the past have had a pretty upbeat look to them, right? These comments are particularly interesting in light of the changes in artwork between Death Note and Bakuman. Both are wordy and analytical stories in a modern-day setting that rely on realistic artwork, just like the series Ashirogi generally makes. But if you skim through the pages of both manga, it becomes apparent that Bakuman sports a much lighter atmosphere. And just to make sure that this was not just a subjective estimate from my end, I decided to run a small experiment. I chose 3 random chapters from different parts of both series and ran them through a tool that allowed me to determine the brightness of an image. And the numbers don't lie. On a scale where 0 means completely black and 100 means completely white, the 3 chapters of Death Note had an average of brightness of 76, and the 3 chapters of Bakuman, 85. So in other words, the results of my, admittedly small sample size shows that Death Note is 9 percentage points darker than Bakuman. So when Ohba and Obata created a series that was much more shonen in tone, they reflected this difference also through the lighter art style. And when Mashiro changes his own art style to become more appealing to his target demographic, his artistic development mirrors the change in Obata's style between Death Note and Bakuman. There's another instance in Bakuman that can be read as a comment on the failings of Death Note as a shonen manga. In the latter half of the story, Bakuman introduces an evil manga artist, Toru Nanamine. Nanamine adored the earlier, darker works by Muto Ashirogi and took the lesson that the world is all about money and intelligence to heart. Nanamine is a talented artist but rejects all the values celebrated by Bakuman's narratives. He sources many of his story ideas from people on the internet instead of doing the hard work himself. He resorts to trickery to get published as quickly as possible rather than enduring blood, sweat, and tears like other creators. And tellingly, his first manga, Classroom of Truth, tramples on the usual values of shonen manga. In this one-shot, a school class is trapped inside a classroom. A mysterious voice from the speakers announces that they will participate in a survival game and that only the last person standing will be allowed to leave. In the first game, everyone who tells a lie gets killed. Most everyone who reads Classroom of Truth is enthralled by this gripping tale, but it's also consistently pointed out that this manga is absolutely not suited for Shonen Jump. It's a manga about the worst sides of human nature and actively renounces the guiding principles of Shonen Jump: friendship, effort, and victory. And this portrayal of Classroom of Truth in Bakuman is fascinating because these very same criticisms can be applied to Death Note as well. Death Note is an outlier among Jump manga, not just because of its focus on mind games, but mainly because it too spurns the typical shonen values. Its protagonist Light is an evil manipulator with little regard for others, and the ideals he strives for are morally questionable already at the onset, and as the story progresses, he only becomes more tainted and corrupted by his power over life and death. But Light does not have to be the only one whose views are gradually warped. If you want to make sure that your understanding of manga will be tainted and corrupted like Light, consider subscribing to the channel, and you too might become the next edgy anti-hero. Why the hell am I doing this stuff? Anyways, given that Classroom of Truth is in that... Given that Classroom of Truth is in Bakuman the manga most similar to Death Note in terms of its moral outlook, it's especially fascinating that Bakuman actually dedicates 18 full pages to the beginning of Classroom of Truth. For perspective, this is more space than is allotted to any other story within the story, and that includes even the works of our protagonists. Bakuman pulls out all the stops to immerse us readers as much in Classroom of Truth as it has immersed the characters in the manga. The irony here is that the real-life version of Shonen Jump published almost an entire chapter's worth of pages of a manga that, according to Bakuman's characters, could never have been published by that very magazine. And Classroom of Truth occupies a curious position among all the manga in Bakuman. It is unquestionably the product of a character we grow to despise ever more the further we get into the story. And it also presents a moral outlook that is diametrically opposed to all the values Bakuman propagates over the course of its story. And yet, nowhere else does Bakuman try to entice us as much with one of its internal manga as with Classroom of Truth. We cannot help but be drawn to it, like moths to a flame. So in some way, Classroom of Truth is the most honest reflection on what made Death Note such a success. It's an attempt to capture Death Note's appeal to such a large audience, but it also acknowledges its ultimate failings as a shonen manga. Yet, Death Note is not the only manga that informs Mashiro's and Takagi's development as manga artists. In an earlier part of the story, Bakuman closely mirrors the origin story of perhaps the most important shonen manga of all time, Dragon Ball. After their first manga series gets cancelled, their new editor Miura pushes his own preferences onto them. He pressures them into creating a comedy series. Most other characters seem puzzled by this choice. They repeatedly note that this type of manga does not play to the strengths of the Ashiroge duo. Nevertheless, after many heated discussions, Miura manages to convince Takagi to give comedy a chance. They eventually publish the series Vroom, Daihatsu Tanto, which is about an aged inventor who creates all kinds of wacky inventions for his grandson. Tanto receives a lukewarm response. It becomes popular among Jump's younger audiences and consistently ranks around the middle of the magazine. But at the same time, this change of genre takes its toll on Takagi. He finds it increasingly difficult to come up with new gags as the series progresses. And the run of Tanto is, more than any of the other Ashiroge series, characterized by struggle and despair. The blow that finally pushes the two over the edge comes when they learn that Nizuma, who has always been a massive fan of their work, has stopped reading Tanto. All their frustration finally boils over, and they beg the head editors to let them end their current series. But the Jump editorial staff will hear none of this. They still view Tanto as a valuable asset and threaten to ban the Ashiroge duo from working for Jump if they abandon their series. But Mashiro and Takagi's determination eventually gets them a massive concession. The two get permission to end Tanto under the condition that they will create a series that can seriously compete with Nizuma before the end of the year. But if they fail, they will never be allowed to work for Jump again. With these conditions, and some help from their former editor Hattori, they eventually create their first successful manga, PCP, Perfect Crime Party. This part of the story takes heavy aspiration from one of the most famous tales from the annals of Shonen Jump history. Tanto is conspicuously similar in premise and artwork to Akira Toriyama's first manga series, Dr. Slump, a series that ran for 4 years in the early 80s. Dr. Slump is a light-hearted comedy manga about a robot girl Arale and her inventor, Senbei Norimaki. Aside from the general similarities in premise, some smaller details line up as well. Where Arale and Senbei are both named after various kinds of rice crackers, the characters in Tanto are all named after car brands. The inventor in Tanto is also in love with his grandson's teacher, just like Senbei, who is infatuated with Arale's teacher. But where the parallels between Tanto and Dr. Slump become more interesting is in how Toriyama's first manga was ended. As Toriyama's editor Kazuhiko Torishima recounted in an interview, Toriyama wanted to end the series as early as half a year into its run. Just like Takagi, Toriyama greatly struggled with the process of writing this episodic comedy series. But the Jump editorial staff was reluctant to end the series because Dr. Slump, more so than Tanto and Bakuman, had become a massive commercial success. Toriyama finally persuaded the then editor-in-chief to allow him to create a new series if he was able to come up with something more interesting than Dr. Slump. And what was the manga that Toriyama eventually landed on? Dragon Ball, one of the most successful and influential manga of all times. When I first found out about the story behind Dragon Ball's creation, I was absolutely stunned by how closely it was mirrored in Bakuman. From the similarities between Dr. Slump and Tanto to their creators' wishes to end the series and the conditions placed on them by the two editors-in-chief. And these parallels are deeply significant to our understanding of Bakuman. When Mashiro and Takagi fulfill the conditions to end Tanto, they have implicitly created a Dragon Ball of sorts. We're given to understand that they have now, after many trials and failures, finally penned a truly successful manga, and reached the level necessary to become pillars of Shonen Jump. There's also a further moment where the parallel between PCP and Dragon Ball becomes highly significant. As the duo starts coming into their own with PCP, Nizuma steps up his own game as well to outdo his rivals. He issues an artistic challenge to the dialogue-heavy PCP. He publishes a chapter with no dialogue at all, thereby showcasing his ability to tell a story with his artwork alone. And with this wordless chapter, Nizuma crushes Ashirogi in the reader's survey. Now, I'm sure that there are many real-life examples of manga with a chapter without dialogue, but one particular instance stands out in the history of Shonen Jump, that being the final game of Takehiko Inoue's basketball manga Slam Dunk, which famously plays out with no dialogue whatsoever. The full implications of this only become apparent when we consider Slam Dunk's place in the history of shonen manga. Slam Dunk was one of the two mega hits that ushered in the golden age of Shonen Jump in the early 90s, together with Toriyama's Dragon Ball. So in other words, Nizuma gets the better of the manga that has been associated with Dragon Ball by drawing inspiration from the only manga that could give Dragon Ball a run for its money at the height of its popularity. Now, there's one final parallel that may be significant if we are looking at Bakuman as a reflection on Ohba's own career. Tsugumi Ohba is a pen name, and like many manga artists, Ohba keeps his cards close to his chest about his personal identity. But there's a popular Japanese fan theory that Tsugumi Ohba is the same person as Hiroshi Gamo, the artist of a comedy manga that ran in Jump in the 90s, called Tottemo Luckyman. Now, I want you to take the following part with a heavy grain of salt. It's never been proven that Ohba is Gamo, and I'll be relying on what is essentially circular arguments here. My interpretation of certain parts of Bakuman rests on the assumption that Ohba is Gamo, but the main arguments supporting that theory are derived from those exact details in Bakuman. Nevertheless, I want to at least entertain his theory, because it could add a significant layer to an autobiographical interpretation of Bakuman. So, in Bakuman, Mashiro wanted to become a manga artist as a child out of admiration for his uncle, who was a manga artist under the pen name Taro Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi achieved a modest success with his comedy series Superhero Legends, but he ultimately failed to sustain a career as a manga artist. Despite repeated rejections after the ending of Superhero Legends, he kept drawing and eventually died from overwork. After his uncle's death, Mashiro gave up his aspirations to become a manga artist until his fateful meeting with Takagi. But Taro Kawaguchi remains a constant inspiration for Mashiro throughout his career. Mashiro aims to achieve that which his uncle could not, a lasting career as a manga artist and first place in the reader's survey. One of the main reasons why fans have speculated that Tsugumi Ohba is the same person as Hiroshi Gamo is because, just like how Reversi is basically Death Note, and From Daihatsu Tanto is basically Dr. Slump, Kawaguchi's Superhero Legends is basically Tottemo Luckyman. Both are parody superhero series, and the main character from Superhero Legends closely resembles the titular Luckyman. Fans have also noted stylistic similarities between Gamo's art style and Ohba's storyboards for Bakuman, some of which are showcased in the manga's physical volumes. Bakuman also implies that Superhero Legends was serialized at the same time as Luckyman. Luckyman was originally published in Shonen Jump between 1993 and 1997. Bakuman allows us to reconstruct the following timeline for Taro Kawaguchi. Bakuman's story begins in 2006, the same year as when the manga began publication. Kawaguchi passed away 3 years before the present timeline, so around 2003. At that point, he had failed to publish another successful series for 7 years. Bakuman also establishes that Kawaguchi had been published in Jump in 1996. So, in Bakuman's timeline, Superhero Legends ended in 1996 or 1997, basically the same time as Luckyman in the real world. And just like Kawaguchi, Gamo also seems to have made some further attempts to continue his career in manga, but never managed to land another hit after Tottemo Luckyman. As we've seen, Mashiro and Takagi in Bakuman to a certain extent mirror Ohba and Obata. And now, one of them is related to a failed manga artist with striking similarities to Gamo, and carries on his will. Moreover, Kawaguchi died around 2003, which is, if you've been paying attention to dates, the very year in which Death Note began serialization in Jump. In other words, Bakuman's equivalent of Gamo possibly died in 2003 because this was the year that his real-life counterpart was reborn, as Tsugumi Ohba. And when Mashiro eventually takes up his uncle's mantle and succeeds where his uncle failed, we may be reading a deeply personal story about a creator who has finally found true success in the manga industry after receiving a fresh start and a new moniker. Now, I'd like to end with what is, from a biographical perspective, perhaps the most powerful statement in Bakuman. A storyline where the manga directly responds to a dark page in Death Note's reception history. In September 2007, a mutilated corpse was found in a park in Brussels. But what attracted international attention to this case was that 2 notes were found near the victim, reading "Watashi wa Kira desu," meaning "I am Kira," in reference to the name with which the characters in Death Note refer to the elusive supernatural killer. And for this reason, Belgian media dubbed this the Manga Murder, the Manga Murder. It must have greatly shaken Ohba and Obata that Death Note may have inspired a real-life atrocity. 4 years later, they used Bakuman as a vehicle to offer a heartfelt response to these events. The storyline takes place during the run of Perfect Crime Party, which revolves around a group of elementary school students who pull off harmless, elaborate tricks, in their words, perfect crimes. One day, Mashiro and Takagi are confronted with a news story that shakes them to their core. A criminal has broken into a bank vault. The criminal stole nothing, but they left behind a single note. These events appear to be inspired by a scene in PCP, because at the beginning of the manga, the protagonists discuss how cool it would be to one day commit that very act. The media and Bakuman quickly pick up on the similarity and denounce PCP for, essentially, corrupting the youth. The Jump editorial staff does all it can to back Mashiro and Takagi, and repeatedly stresses that they do not have to change anything about their manga. After all, PCP is not a story that promotes crime. This is remarkably one of the rare instances where Mashiro and Takagi receive unconditional support from the Jump editorial staff. After all, many of the conflicts in Bakuman revolve around collisions between the duo and their editors or Jump's editor-in-chief. So by taking out any potential interference from the Jump editorial office from the onset, Bakuman has the opportunity to place full emphasis on how the abuse of one's creative work can impact creators. We're shown to what extent Takagi was rattled by the bank robbery. From that day, he becomes unable to write compelling stories. In the wake of the Bakuman equivalent of the Manga Murder, Takagi unintentionally stops writing anything that could be considered a crime. In Mashiro's words, the new PCP chapters lack all of the usual fun of their perfect crimes, and both the quality and the reader reception of PCP keep dropping week after week as Takagi remains creatively paralyzed. But the tide turns when the PCP imitator strikes again, and this time they even leave a note mentioning PCP directly. Just like in the Belgian murder case, the connection with the manga is now undeniable. And as the news breaks, many characters worry how this will impact Takagi's mental health. They fear that this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But instead of giving in, Mashiro and Takagi come to the same conclusion. They will respond to the events by introducing a PCP copycat into their story and denouncing his actions. After all his doubts and struggles, Takagi, and perhaps by extension Ohba, comes out on top and makes an incredibly brave statement about their work. Takagi and Ohba make sure that their readers understand how they feel as creators and confirm their unwavering resolve to never give in to anyone who commits evil acts in the name of their creations.